So as a way to kickstart stuff, both of you are entrepreneurs building what you believe needs to be built for the future of messaging and the phone number. So I'm going to start the conversation with two questions, and I'll give you both each time to answer both. First is product market fit, or what is it that you're building, why are you building, whom are you building it for? And the second one is founder market fit, which is why are you the right person to build it, right? So I'll start with you, Noah, and then we'll come to Randy.
Okay, well, thank you, TJ. Well, I think we've heard the reason I'm into what I'm doing is because the technology I work with is all about collaboration. It's all about feedback loop, and it's all about sharing information in a secure and safe manner that may be considered highly sensitive. And that technology is blockchain, which is, to me, it was an eye-opener of an amazing new network that takes all these things from this thing called Web 2.0, which is basically the internet, which we forgot one important aspect being identity. And we moved along with this wonderful technology and left that behind. So what blockchain allows to do is actually share information and fill those gaps in such a way that allows multi-industries to collaborate, not just even one industry. And to answer your second question, nobody else would do it. So challenging the status quo of how people keep their databases siloed. And if you look at the industry we live in, every time you turn around, there's a new database that pops up. And that new database guarantees they're going to solve the problem, but they're only solving one problem at a time, and they're not sharing data. So if we could just get along and trust the people that are founders just like me, that are innovators, then we can collaborate and solve this problem together, and that's what solving a shared problem is all about.
Randy?
Well, let me talk for a moment just about what our product is and what Provenant is doing. So Provenant is helping organizations to prove things about themselves digitally and in real time. And this benefits organizations because they care about their reputations, they care about compliance, and they don't want to be ripped off by imposters. And consumers also want to make sure that they care about the authenticity of the communication. And at the same time, they want to know who is it that's on the other end. So to do this, getting to the product, Provenant is using open global standards like verifiable credentials and digital signatures to accomplish this. And one of our key partnerships is actually with a Swiss nonprofit organization called Glyph, which some of you may have heard about Glyph. But Glyph was actually created by the G20 and by the Financial Stability Board after the Great Recession. And they were mandated within the financial sector to issue a legal entity identifier to every financial organization operating in the G20. And that LEI is a 20-character code, and it's been quite a success. They have over 2 million of these LEIs issued, but they're like a social security number. They're an identifier. They're not an authenticator. And what that means is that anybody can write that down. So Glyph has actually been working on an initiative that Provenant has been partnering with, which is to create a digital version of that LEI called a VLEI. And that VLEI is going to be issued throughout the financial industry. So already you've got the biggest high-value senders in the messaging ecosystem, in the voice ecosystem, even in RCS. These financial institutions care about their reputation. They care that people know this message is authentically coming from them. And so moving towards your answer of product market fit, we're already deploying the VLEI. Provenant is actually the first company worldwide that got qualified, that went through the program to begin issuing this digital verifiable version of the LEI. So this is quite important. We're not building a proprietary solution. The G20 would not back a proprietary solution. It needs to be built on open standards for widespread adoption because we need anybody anywhere to be able to verify a call, a message, any digital communication. That needs to be verifiable by anybody in order to get worldwide adoption. So the technology that we're working with is well suited for the market because if you want global reach, all of our international traffic, it needs to be cross-channel, cross-jurisdiction. We're not using a blockchain because it's too limiting, because again, we need everybody to have access to verifiability. So I just want to finish on one last point here. So there are two really critical problems that need to be addressed. One is delegation of authority. And organizations by themselves can't really do anything. It's people that run the businesses. Officers need to be empowered with authority. Employees need to be empowered with authority. External organizations like marketing agencies or contact centers, that's how organizations run. They run by delegating their authority. So if we're going to set up a system where we can have full verifiability and provenance back to the originator, we also need to be able to know the chain of authority that's going all the way back through the organization, because only then can you get back to the source and you can do it in a verifiable way. So verifiable credentials that I mentioned before are an open standard and a means for delegation to happen, and it's verifiable. Second point that I want to make is that we need to bind actors to actions. There's a reason why bank robbers wear masks, right? They want to separate the actor from the action, right? So digital signatures are what allow you to bind the action to the actor. So we've already started to issue the verifiable LEI to organizations. Our queue is full. There are other companies who are going to be like us, qualified VLAI issuers. We welcome them into the ecosystem. We want adoption. We don't want to be the only player. And so these are gaining adoption right now. And I've got, to address the second part of your question, these are open standards. They're going to be applied in every industry. Glyph has already deployed them throughout financials. They're working on healthcare, data supply chains, and physical supply chains. So all of these are going to be, this technology is present. It is Web 5.0, if anything. And the point about messaging is that I've spent 20 years in messaging. I was one of the original developers of the Metcalf platform. Ian Matthews just mentioned the Context platform that Cineverse runs. I actually wrote the patent for that and invented that. So I have the domain experience. We have the domain experience to bring it to telecom. And you know, it's going to take time. It's going to take work, but we're encouraged.
So that was a lot. I have a lot to follow up on that.
I'm going to put this away now.
Okay, but I do want to give the stage back to you, Noah, because Randy brought up a key difference between the way you're approaching the challenge of chain of custody, as you like to call it. But I also want to share that from a background, you also have patents in blockchain technology, quite a few of them, and so talk about your product, and then talk about why you're so optimistic about blockchain being the solution.
I guess what you look at is you look at technology stacks, and I've been building networks my entire life. So looking at this technology stack, it is as open as you can get, and it actually applies to telecom quite neatly. So when I first learned about blockchain, I learned about it because I was in a half telecom, half blockchain event. and I went into the room really not even understanding what blockchain was. In fact, just to get away from those I already knew, needed a break. And soon I discovered that I was in a room with no telecom people, but they basically were giving us a new network to work with. Something that applied to an existing chain of custody, that applied to an existing global identifier that we all, as consumers, use and have accepted. And I've learned over time that technology stacks can eliminate things that you think you need, but you don't need anymore. And ironically, telephone numbers, we haven't needed telephone numbers maybe almost 15, 20 years at this point. And we didn't need them because we could actually use a URL or an IP address. So why did phone numbers survive? Why did phone numbers actually make it beyond the telecom space? I don't think there's anyone in this room that can say, I only use a telephone number to reach somebody or to be reached, or to text somebody or to be texted to. It's actually truly become our digital identifier, and it happens to be globally acceptably unique already. So when I had first drafted the patents and turned them into the WPO, they were very much impressed. I went on from there as I just started to pile on the patents, but it wasn't, I felt almost like a fraud, frankly. And I felt like a fraud because this system already existed. This system was the system of telecom. The only little tweak I did was I applied this new technology stack to something we had a problem with, and we still have a problem with, and we discussed it in this entire event. What's the feedback loop? How do we have it in a mutable chain of custody? So every other chain of custody out there, if it worked, it would already have worked and solved this issue. So really, I look at the unique identifier, by the way, as a valuable asset, because ironically, in what I've designed as the technology stack, really can take any unique identifier. I only use phone numbers in this discussion because it's something that consumers have already adopted and they're readily using today. It's already something as a shared asset. So if you think about cross industries, right? You think about the financial industry. Has there ever been a bank that you don't put your phone number into? Has there been a healthcare department or entity that you don't put your phone number into? We put our phone number into ID ourselves more than we put our social security number. But we treat it so loosely, and we don't have it attested. So I think it's ironic that here I am stumbling into this technology that all I did was do a little tweak, and I think because the parties already exist and there's stakeholder value, when you have stakeholders, you have a reputation score. And if you think about any kind of social network, it's all about reputation. When you think about Stir Shaken, and it was said earlier that as soon as you get a cease and desist from the FCC, your reputation is toast. So having a place that has an immutable data, like a shared database across everyone, which is basically like a Google Doc. Think of how we all used to send docs back and forth and modify them. How convenient that was when one person made a change but didn't adopt your changes, and then somebody else made a change and didn't adopt their changes. What happened was a broken system of information. We do that today, and that's where scammers and Ian talks about this as well. Mun's talked about the collaboration. It really comes into they know we're not talking to each other. They know our weaknesses, and they actually are working together in a better way. So if we had our phone number into a Google Doc, and everyone who had a stake in that number, whether it's a messaging provider, an MNO, a voice provider, we all have our custodial duties to maintain this one centralized number in a decentralized way. And if you think of Google Docs or Slack, why do they exist today? They exist because we need to share something and modify it as a unified approach. So I like Glyph, or Glyph. I like Glyph. I also think that they have governance, and I think that the difference between the governance, because I did a little research, and I wanted to make sure I came to this stage prepared. So when I looked at the FSB, which bad initials, but I would say when I looked at the group, I said, okay, is this a community of governance that I would want to sign up as an individual? And I think of blockchain at the same time. Any big network of community needs governance. So you need people to actually be the governance, you need people to be the police, you need all these parties, just like a real community when you set it up. And if you think of the Wild West, it started wild, then the first thing that you brought in, the law, right? You need to bring in these elements for success. So when I looked at the differences, I looked at, could I reach out to anybody on this G20 list and have a conversation? Well, unless you have a contact and a connection with people at the Federal Reserve that manage all of the money for the entire country at the G20 level, which I couldn't connect with them on LinkedIn, I tried. But there it is, right? Like, I want accessibility and I want a democratic way to vote, right? Like, I don't want a board voting. I want every single member, I want every single one of you with your own identity to have the power and choice to make that decision. And that's the difference why I chose the technology stack that I did, which Glyph is more than welcome to join in because it is a community, and any unique identifier over telecom and using that technology is certainly important.
So let me just comment on one thing, and I appreciate your comments. But just to be clear, Provident is working on organizational identity right now, and we feel like that's a major issue in telecom right now, and that's where we're looking for growth in messaging, for sure. But we also have that problem with voice or shaken, and we have that with RCS. It's made to be about engagement with enterprises. So first of all, I just want to make it clear that it's organizational identity that we're talking about. If you want a source of truth and you want validation for that source of truth, the G20 is a pretty good validator for that. And the Financial Stability Board is in charge of world economies and making sure that they stay in good health. So I don't like the initials either, but the Financial Stability Board is well accredited throughout the world. And Glyph is actually, the VLEI is actually regulated by what's called the Regulatory Oversight Commission, the ROC, okay? Now, when the ROC was authorizing Glyph to move forward with their digital version, the VLEI, they evaluated a bunch of other technologies. They evaluated blockchain solutions. They brought in some big name consultants, and they went through an evaluation period. And what they arrived at was verifiable credentials and carry key management for digital signing, which are fully decentralized. And
correct, but let me interject out there a little bit. So both of you are presenting a new technology for which solutions currently exist, right? I would come back with, if I was someone who was vetting your technology, well, sure, Glyph's deployed in an industry that's got nothing to do with telecom, but what's the adoption rate, right? I can deploy something all I want, but if the very organizations that claim to be Glyph compliant don't use it, it's non-committal.
So we just became the first qualified issuer at the end of December. So we're just beginning.
Yeah, and so you're very early in the adoption process. So I want to be very clear about that. And I'll go back to you, as the fact that, yes, blockchain has shown remarkable scale as being an open source database where anybody can edit, but you can have, you call it chain of custody, some people call it proof of provenance, built in, which is, curiously, what's your company name? But there's also this eye glaze effect. When you talk about blockchain, people just like, how is that different from a database? And I can just use a database and do a write and read access, and it's easy instead of building all this new infrastructure. I do want, because what I would like to, for the audience, to show is a product that, in the time that we have left, the product, how it works, even if it's a MVP stage right now, and the assumptions you're making for that product to succeed in the market. And number one being, like, I will say personally, it was like, okay, we just had a long day of conversations around where 10DLC and all the complexities of adopting that there's so much work to be done. And now we're going to roll out this new ID infrastructure. Why make it worth my time, I guess is the question.
That's a great question, because it really comes into there's a lot of early technologies that start really hot, but then get taken over by a different technology. And I mean, whether it's Laserdisc to DVD, 8-track to tape, there's just so many that you could use. But when you look at the problem that we're trying to solve, it really comes to a birth to traceable path, right? So when you distribute that information as opposed to centralize it, and there's been many studies. So I mean, I don't know what kind of consultants were hired, but I mean, you could look at Accenture. I think they have a few good ones. McKinsey, Ericsson, who like Addis, and had released a white paper. And I haven't seen white papers as like proven out that the technology can not only be adoptable, but scalable in that sense. Not that the identifier itself, just the technology stack that it sits on. So I do see the ability for a paradigm shift. So what we've deployed, and it was really to do with first number ownership and texting, where you had this number that all of a sudden shared 2 attributes. And ironically, each of these attributes had completely different regulatory perceptions. You had one that was highly regulated, being a voice attribute attached to this telephone number, which telephone number itself is an interesting statement. And then you had this messaging attribute. Ironically, it showed how quickly a diverse or a divergence can happen. So you had the single asset, and now you lived in 2 different worlds. You have a voice world that all the voice people deal with, number portability, they have regulations, and then CPNI, which is really customer proprietary network information. You have all these rules to protect you. And then you have this messaging side that was like literally the Wild West. There was no regulation at all. In fact, they kept it unregulated, and now we're in this big hot mess of robo-texting. So, when you think about, centralized databases, we've been trusting everybody with our data for a long time. All these third parties. I don't think, again, there's anyone in this room that hasn't dealt with a vendor that's supposedly taking care of their data that hasn't had their data hacked. I mean, T-Mobile, AT&T, Citibank, name it. Cineverse was hacked for a while, for years, and nobody even knew. So whenever you centralize data, you put the biggest target for a fraudster or a real criminal to go after. Not in the phishing side like Ian said. That's an entirely different ring of criminals. But when you put things into a centralized way, like the country of India put the biggest bank robbery in history, was because the consolidation of banks rolled up, speaking of banks, right, the financial industry, right? So here's a bank, the biggest bank in the world, one of the biggest banks in the world, because of acquisition and roll-up, became the biggest bank robbery in history. So just imagine that when you have a centralized database, what you're doing is you're just putting this big old target saying to all the people that really want the data all at once, they could either go to each one of you, or they can go to this big old trough of it and go after it. So what we did was we solved for number protection first in the asset of messaging, because now it's a separate piece to it. We're working with folks to manage the population into multiple databases. So in other words, similar to what Glyph is doing, where you have this driver's license of ID, but this time it's your phone number to start, and it attaches to all this data behind it, but now you own it, and you start sharing it with third parties. They don't own it anymore. You start sharing it.
But how do you prove the right to use that telephone number? Nobody owns a telephone number. It's assigned. It's leased, right? So it's
Not
really a
sure.
matter of right to use, right? So how do you create that binding because even the right to use a telephone number can shift quite quickly. If you think about call centers, I wasn't even aware of this use case until recently, but call centers may rotate numbers between customers. For 15 minutes, it might be this customer, then they rotate it to another number. So the right to use the telephone number is very dynamic, right? So we need a system that can be that responsive and that dynamic and that flexible and that granular, and you accomplish that through delegation and through cryptographically verifiable digital signatures.
So it looks to me that you guys are talking the same solution, but still there is very
We're absolutely in agreement on cryptography, right? I mean, certainly, and digital signatures. That's
correct. But-
Toll-free numbers, by the way, were
So what I'm
sold.
going to do in the interest of time, we are up on time. So
But I would also just add to that, because Ian made a statement about Stir Shaken, and I would just also add that just like Noah, in my opinion, has something right, Stir Shaken has something right too. They're signing traffic, okay? They're creating a binding between the traffic, which is the action, and the actor, right? The only problem was with Stir Shaken is that you've got the service provider signing and not the enterprise, and anytime you have a gap, and this is really what it comes down to. If I can just indulge to make my last point, is that the solution Provident is working with, our partnership with Glyph is very important. But anybody, any vetter can utilize this technology. If WMC wants to issue a verifiable credential when they finish their vetting process, they can do that. And now that enterprise can prove to anyone in the messaging channel, voice channel, RCS channel that they've been vetted by WMC. If Aegis wants to vet, and then they want to vet the officers and the employees and the marketing person who's going to go to TCR to sign up for the service, they can do that. So Glyph is just a model because it's sanctioned by one of the most globally respected organizations. Okay, but the technology can be used at a very low level by anyone.
correct, and thank you for that summary. But I will say that for both of you, the challenge is going to be convincing the people in this room, because you are very early in your product life cycle, that it's worth the time, because the tech industry, as you brought up, Betamax and is littered with technology that actually were only marginally better than the current solution, and so they never got out of the gate. So on that, I will say thank you so much for coming on board and very spirited
Thank you.
conversation, and thank you everyone.